My name is Heidi Blair, and I'm a master's student at the University of Montana studying International Conservation and Development in the W.A. Franke College of Forestry and Conservation. I'm excited to welcome you all to the first installment of this year's President's Lecture Series at the University of Montana. The series is designed to provide the opportunity for our community to gather, learn, and discuss ideas and issues, and to challenge us to engage in meaningful discussions with one another, both on and off campus. Tonight, we're honored to welcome New York Times columnist David Brooks to kick off the 2018-2019 lineup. Before we get started, let me explain how the question and answer session will work at the end of the lecture. In addition to the opportunity that you had to submit questions at the welcome desk in the lobby, you can also email them to pls@umontana.edu. PLS stands for President's Lecture Series. Again, that's pls@umontana.edu, and that will be up on the screen at the end of the lecture. Now, I'd like to introduce you to the President of the University of Montana, Seth Bodnar. President Bodnar graduated first in his class at West Point, earned 2 master's degrees at Oxford University, and was a Rhodes and Truman Scholar. He also had a distinguished military career, serving in the 101st Airborne Division, in the U.S. Army's 1st Special Forces Group, as a member of the Army's elite Green Berets, and he continues to serve as an Army Reserves officer. He went on to become the senior executive at General Electric Company, where he was in charge of business transformation and long-term strategy. All of this before coming to UM. Please join me in welcoming President Seth Bodnar to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. Heidi is a great example of why we're all here. I mean, she is a tremendous student, and we're just so proud to have people like Heidi here at the University of Montana. And I want to thank, briefly, I'll be very brief because you're not here to see me, and I'm very, very well aware of that. But I do want to thank everybody for being here this evening. This is a very special event, and tonight, represents what is best both about UM, but also about Missoula. Because here with us tonight, we have students like Heidi, we have high school students, we have city council members, we have business owners, we have nonprofit leaders, we have UM staff and faculty, UM supporters that are just a wonderful part of this community. And we're gathered here in a venue that is a Missoula icon. Here in the Wilma. This is a gathering place for the robust conversations and dialogue, a wonderful place where we enjoy arts and culture and everything that makes this city, this community so special. And I am very proud to be a part of UM, but also to be a part of this community, because these two, our campus community, our Missoula community, we feed each other. In terms of our intellectual, our cultural, our economic, the recreational needs of a healthy university, a healthy city, a healthy state, a healthy nation. And before I introduce David Brooks, I do want to just give a 30-second history of the PLS, the President's Lecture Series. This is one of UM's academic gems. The PLS began in 1987 under then President Jim Cook. And this was a way for us to gather, to learn, to discuss ideas and issues that animate our society. And in fact, Donna Cook, Jim's wife, is here with us tonight. And we're so proud to have Donna here with us. And we also have former President Sheila Stearns and her wonderful husband Hal, as well as Royce and Mary Engstrom. We're very happy to have them here with us as well. And I also want to acknowledge Richard Drake. Richard was here in 1987, and he ran the PLS for 31 years. He was a steady curator. He ensured this series' excellence. And as we begin a new year of the PLS, I want to acknowledge and thank Richard for his more than 3 decades of service of bringing talks like this to the Missoula community. Now, Richard and Jim and Sheila and Royce have set a high bar, but I'm very confident that the PLS is going to continue to engage and challenge all of us, both on campus and beyond. We have new leadership. I want to thank political science professor Rob Saldin, with the support also of Professor of Art Elizabeth Dove and Associate Director of the Mansfield Center, Dina Mansour. These three are leading our PLS, and I will tell you that this series is in the hands of a smart, creative, and well-respected team, members of the university and the community. And so you're in a treat. You're in for a treat tonight and over the years as the PLS continues to grow and thrive. And I want to say very clearly that tonight's lecture at the Wilma was an intentional decision. This signals that UM is better because we're here in Missoula, and Missoula is better because UM is here. And we are joint catalysts. We are partners, and I have a deep and abiding faith in the power of that partnership to enable great things, both for this community and for our university. And I am so grateful that you all are here with us tonight. And it's a good thing when you have a line wrapping around the corner. And I think we were able to get some live stream opportunities for those who weren't able to make it in. So I do want to acknowledge and thank those of you who showed up tonight and weren't able to come into the theater itself, but are watching in other venues. So now for the main event, and I'm going to be very brief introducing David, because he really needs no introduction. He is a leading voice in American public life, a columnist at the New York Times. He teaches at Yale. He's a regular on PBS NewsHour. He has been someone who Chelsea and I, on our very exciting Friday nights with young kids, we DVR the NewsHour and we watch Shields and Brooks once we get the kids to bed. So I think many can relate to that based on the reaction. So, and David's an author of 4 books. His most recent, The Road to Character, many of us here have read. It's a New York Times bestseller. His list of accomplishments and contributions to public life are numerous, but I do want to highlight 2. One is that, in addition to all his accomplishments, he's smart, because he said Montana is his favorite state. And exactly. And that this is his favorite part of Montana, too. In fact, a chapter in his book, Bobos in Paradise, was set right here in Missoula. And look, this is a very timely lecture, because this lecture in this university, what it's here for is to encourage respectful, informed debate. And that's what David does for this country. And his thoughts on the importance of social fabric and the importance of communities in the future of this country is incredibly insightful and very timely for this community. And tonight he'll be talking about the cultural revolution that we need. So without further ado, please join me in giving David Brooks a warm Missoula welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we're done here. I'm happy. It is true, Montana is my favorite state, and this is my favorite part. I say that no matter where I am. Except in Wyoming. I say Wyoming. I told the group earlier today at the university that my father was a college professor, taught at NYU, and when I was 12, he was moving on. He got 2 job offers, which he seriously considered. One of them was at a school outside of Philadelphia, and the other was at Montana State in Bozeman. And he chose the school outside of Philadelphia, but has left this shadow in my life of who I would be if I'd come here. I think I'd be like 6'3". I'd be like strapping, throwing moose around or whatever, having sensitive moments on the river, all that kind of stuff. No, it is a great pleasure to be here, and I'm going to come back and do more fishing next time. Now, I am, by reputation and by fact, somewhat of a bookish person. And so when I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear. And at that moment, I decided I wanted to become a writer. And so books have been my life ever since then. I remember in high school, I wanted to date a woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so, so that would have been a difference of values. And then I went to a bookish college. The admissions officers at Wesleyan, Brown, and Columbia decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And so the famous saying about Chicago, no longer true, where fun goes to die. The more accurate one is it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so that's, we did attract Norman MacLean, though, to be fair. So I went to Chicago. I was a double major. I majored in history and celibacy. I teach now at Yale because I only teach at schools I couldn't have gotten into. And my students are amazing. I was nothing like that. They, you ask them, what are you doing on spring break? It's, I'm going to unicycle across Thailand while reading to lepers. They're doing all that stuff. But I did learn some skills. How to dominate classroom discussion while doing none of the readings. I managed a fighter called the Kosher Killer, a boxer. And we decided to do it the University of Chicago way. We didn't actually practice boxing. We just read books about boxing. And we entered him in the Chicago Golden Gloves. This is true. And he, because of a series of health issues with the other fighters, he got a series of byes up to the semifinals. And so he came out, he'd never boxed in his life, just with his arms swinging like this. The other fighter had never seen anything like this. He shot back into his corner, and then 92 seconds in realized, well, one uppercut ends this, which is what happened. So all this to say, I'm bookish. I'm on TV, which is usually a visual medium, unless you're on the NewsHour. And we're sort of even bookish there. We do this segment called Shields and Brooks. We wanted to call it Brooke Shields. That would have been better. But I think Mark has been here. And some of you may know, it's now called Shields and Brooks. Before that, it was Shields and Shigo. And before that, it was Shields and Gergen. And then before that, it was Shields and Coolidge, I think. Mark has been doing it for a while. Now, our show is, I love being on the show. We have a certain demographic. So if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. She's going to say, I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. And so, it's always good to be super big in the hospice community. So that's sort of bookish. And then I write a column at the New York Times. I'm the conservative columnist at the Times, a job I liken to being chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company a lot of the times. And so again, more writing, just writing. Though I think as you get older, you get a little more feminine in your taste if you're a guy. I think you let your emotions go. So I read more emotional books now. I'm the only American man who finished that book, Eat, Pray, Love, if you remember that book. By page 123, I was actually lactating, which was interesting. And then about 8 years ago, I wrote a book on emotion called The Social Animal. And all my friends joke that me writing a book about emotion is like Gandhi writing about gluttony. It's like not what I knew about. And then just recently, I wrote a book on character called The Road to Character. And writing that book, I learned that writing a book on character doesn't actually give you good character. And even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. So I recommend that. And so all this to say is I'm bookish. And I do a lot of my life up here. But even I have to recognize that the thinking, the rational brain, is the third most important part of our consciousness. And the first is the desiring heart, the things we love. I read about a guy recently who bought a house with a driveway and it had a bamboo stand nearby, and he hated bamboo. So he took an axe and he chopped down the bamboo, then he dug a hole and chopped up the root system of what was left of the bamboo. Then he poured plant poison over everything. Then he put 3 feet of gravel in the hole, and then he covered it over with concrete. And 2 years later, little stick of bamboo shooting up. And in my view, we all have that. We are existential sharks. We all have our desires. And what we desire most is love. And love forms us. There were these orphanages in the 1950s where the doctors gave the children, these little infants, food and good health care, but they didn't want to have them spread germs, so they did not physically touch them. The mortality rate at age 2 was 38%, because it's the actual touch, the loving touch that wires the fibers of the brain together. There's a great study called the Grant Study that took a bunch of men from 1940s to their deaths and studied all their lives. And they found the biggest predictor of success in life was not IQ or social position, it was coming from a loving home. The men who had no deep love in their home were 3 times more likely to suffer mental illness, 2.5 times more likely to suffer dementia in old age, and made 50% less money over the course of their careers. Some of these men went into the army in World War II, many of them did, and some rose to become generals or majors or colonels, some stayed privates. And so they wanted to know what correlated with success in the army. It wasn't IQ, it wasn't social status, it wasn't even physical courage, it was relationship with mother. And the men who had mothers who'd poured love into them knew how to pour love into their men, and they were good officers. So we're defined by what we love. And I'm always, and sometimes love strikes with amazing speed. I was in Houston, where my wife used to live, and came across a guy who describes this woman, a concert pianist, who was about to move to San Francisco to be with her fiance. And she decided, before I go, I'll get my hair done. So she went into this salon called Etude de Paris, and she looked over a guy cutting hair, and she went back to the back of the salon, put on her gown, and called her mother, and said, I've just seen the man I'm actually gonna marry. So she gets her shampoo, and then she's sitting in the chair, and she asks the guy's name. His name is David, who told me the story. And he's asking her life story, and she says, well, I'm a concert pianist. I'm about to move to San Francisco to be with my fiance, but I won't go if you'll marry me. And so David, as he tells the story, he looked at his scissors and he said, I never felt more free than I did at that instant. And he said, it's a deal. And they've been married for 17 years now. And so love time can sometimes strike quickly, sometimes slowly. But what the heart really desires is fusion with another. The kind of fusion that Louis de Bernier described in a great novel called Captain Corelli's Mandolin. And in that novel, there's an old guy talking to his daughter about his late wife. And he says to her, love itself is what is left over when being in love is burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew toward each other underground, and when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found out that we were one tree and not two. And I think that's what we're all yearning for, that kind of just lifelong fusion with another person that we love. So that's the first most important part of our consciousness. The second is the yearning soul. I don't ask you to believe in God or not believe in God, that's not my department. But I do ask you to believe that you have a soul, that there's some place that has no shape, size, or color, but is of infinite value and dignity. Rich and successful people don't have more of this than the rest of us. Older people don't have more than younger people. Slavery is wrong because it's an indignation on another human being's soul. Rape is wrong because rape is not just an attack on a bunch of physical molecules, it covers over another person's soul. Obscenity is anything that covers over a soul. And what this soul does is it yearns for righteousness. We all want to lead good lives. I've covered crime, I've covered wars, I've met people who've committed horrible acts, but I've never met anyone who did not want to be good. And when we meet somebody, I was talking about at the afternoon session today, when we meet somebody who is good, we see someone who just radiates with joy. They just have an inner light. I was saying that I met the Dalai Lama, and he just laughs for no reason at all. He just starts laughing. And you want to be polite, so you laugh, and he laughs, and you laugh. And I notice this phenomenon with a lot of people's lives. They get out of school, and they think they're going to climb their mountain, like their mountain is their career, building a family. And they get to the top of their mountain, and it's kind of unsatisfying. Or maybe they get knocked off their mountain by failure or by something terrible, and they're down in the valley. And down in the valley, they actually see that that first mountain was not really the satisfying mountain they wanted to climb. There's a second mountain ahead of them. And if the first mountain is self-centered and building up the ego and building up the identity, the second mountain is about pouring forth into community, into love, into other people. And I see many lives. I met a guy who was a banker in North Carolina. Banking was fine, but somehow it didn't satisfy him. And now he's helping young men transition out of prison. And he radiates with that kind of inner joy. And the weird thing about this, the soul, is that it's very powerful. This yearning for goodness is very powerful, but it's reclusive. You can go years in your life and not really think about it. So I think of it like a reclusive mountain cat or a leopard, something that's up in the hills. And you go through your life, and it's up in the mountains a lot, and you barely glimpse it through the trees. Sometimes you have one of those horrible anxiety-ridden nights when you're really suffering, and you wake up at 2 a.m. with, as a poet said it, with your thoughts like a drawer full of knives. And in that vulnerability, you sort of hear the rumbling of the soul. And then there are fantastic moments when you're just filled with rapture and gratitude for existence, and you feel the swell of it. But I think there are also moments, maybe later in life, when the leopard comes out of the hills and it sits in the room in front of you and asks you the fundamental questions. What good have you done? What is your purpose? Where do you derive meaning in your life? And for those who haven't thought about those questions, they have to live with that fact. But I think we all, at one point or another, our lives fall apart unless we have answers to those questions. And I've emphasized the heart and the soul because sometimes our public social sciences, sometimes our public discussion, sometimes our political talk, we treat it like we're just self-interested brains who are only out for our own good, that we're only interested in money and status and power. But we are whole people. And we have divorced from that, and sometimes a lot of our errors come from not appreciating how a whole person operates rather than just a brain or a body. Now, one of the things that whole people do is they create collective cultures. They create systems of relationship to solve their problems. And the culture of any given moment is a collective response to the problems of that moment. And I'm going to talk about a few cultures in our nation's past. The first one is from 1932 to 1968. This was a time when they faced depression, World War, and this was a very group-oriented culture. Big organizations, the Army, the labor unions, IBM. The ethos was we're all in this together. If you lived on Chicago's South Side where I went to school, you probably followed your father and grandfather into the Nabisco plant. You joined the same union. There were no TVs then and no air conditioning. So in the summertime, the doors were left open and the kids were running from home to home, and you had really tight communities. People were in coffee klatches, babysitting co-ops, trading household goods. If somebody asked you where you were from, you didn't say, I'm from Chicago. You said, I'm from 59th and Pulaski, because the corners really mattered. And if you wanted to get ahead in the world, you joined a big organization, and you rose up the hierarchy. There was a guy named John Ferry who served as a Democrat in the Illinois state legislature, and he was rewarded by his boss Daley, with a term in Congress. And he was asked how he would vote, and he replied, I will go to Washington to represent Mayor Daley. For 21 years, I represented the mayor in the legislature, and he was always right. And so that's deference to authority. And that has a lot of good features. Has close friendships, tight families, good communities. But that culture tolerated a lot of weakness, a lot of racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, emotional coldness, boring food. And so people chopped it up. and they wanted a more individualistic culture, and we had a shift in culture. And to me, that shift was symbolized by a moment in my childhood, Super Bowl III. In that was about 1969, 1970, two great quarterbacks faced each other who grew up in basically the same area of Western Pennsylvania. On one side was a 1950s guy, Johnny Unitas. Crew cut, high top shoes, boring as the day is long. Good quarterback, but played just like a plumber, doing his job well. Across the field was another guy named Joe Namath. He was a swinger, long hair, $5,000 fur coats, posed for pantyhose ads. He wrote a memoir called I Can't Wait Until Tomorrow Because I Get Better Looking Every Day. Johnny Unitas would not have written that memoir. And so there was a shift in culture. What was cool now was to be young, not old, expressive, not reticent, casual, not formal, rebel, not a conformist. It was an individualistic culture, and it was all about individual liberation, to be liberated from dogma, local opinion, and that individualism, that freedom, gave us a lot of good things. It gave us the civil rights movement, feminism, the peace movement, the age of Aquarius. I don't think we could have had Silicon Valley and all the whole rebel culture unless we'd had that movement, that rebellious attitude. It gave us some bad things too. A sharp rise in narcissism, a sharp rise in the desire for fame, and some downsides. If you take any true idea, it becomes false if you take it to an extreme. And we've had a pretty good run of individualism over the last 40 or 50 years. And it's left us with three overlapping crises. The first is a crisis of isolation. In 1980, 20% of Americans reported feeling lonely. Now twice as many do. A generation ago, only 8% of Americans lived alone. Now 30% do. In 1970, married couples entertained in their home an average of 15 times a year. Now it's 8. Only 8% of Americans report having important conversations with their neighbors. The fastest growing political party is unaffiliated. The fastest growing religious movement is unaffiliated. Suicides have been rising since 1999 and are now at a 30-year high. And then 55,000 people die every year of opiate addiction. And suicide is just a proxy for loneliness, and so is opiate addiction. The second is an institutional crisis of distrust, a loss of faith in each other. If you asked people a generation ago, do you trust the people around you? Majority, 60% said, yeah, I trust the people around me. The people around me are trustworthy. Now it's down to 32% and 19% of millennials. The younger you go, the more distrustful people are. And that's not perception, that's reality. People are less trustworthy, it's their behavior. The third problem is a crisis of meaning, a crisis of purpose. It's amazing to me that mental health problems are rising, not falling. Depression rates are rising, not falling. I see it in my students. They get out of college, they have a setback, and they really it hits them hard. Nietzsche says, he who has a why to live for can endure any how. But if you don't know what your purpose is, then when you have the setbacks, you crumble. And I see that moral hunger and a moral vacuum in student after student. And so these three overlapping crises produce a fourth crisis, which is a reaction to the first. When you leave human beings naked and alone, they do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do, which is they revert to tribe. Tribalism is an attempt to cure the loss of community, but it's an attempt to do it through hatred and not through love and affection. Tribalism is a scarcity mentality. Tribalism is based on friend-enemy distinctions, us-them barriers. It's a warrior mentality. Politics is war, ideas are combats, society is tribal, we need to build wars, erect barriers. It's not based on love of your own side, it's based on hatred of the other side. And that populism is the rising thing we see in the country. I lived in Europe for the 1990s, and I covered a lot of great events for the Wall Street Journal. I covered the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, Mandela coming out of prison in South Africa, the Oslo peace process in the Middle East. I covered one event that wasn't as good and was terrible. It was the Yugoslav Civil War. In retrospect, 25 years later, I realized that event was actually the most important event I covered because it predicted the rise of tribalism, the rise of nationalism, the rise of populism that has happened across the world ever since. And so these movements are surging. I spent an afternoon not long ago with Steve Bannon. It was fascinating, actually. It was like being with Trotsky in 1905. And he just had a diagnosis that diverse societies would not succeed, and that he has this global international, he has a 100-year plan, Trump is only a piece of the plan, and he has coherence. He has coherence to his belief system. And maybe that is one future. Maybe we'll go from the period of we're all in this together to the individualistic period of I'm free to be myself, and maybe the next period will be revert to tribe. It looks that way now. But I will say there's another thing that is coming along, which is changing culture, and changing culture in a much better way. How do cultures change? They change often when a group of people, maybe not in the spotlight, find a better way to live, and everybody else wants to copy them. And so over the last 6 or 7 months, I've been working with the Aspen Institute on a project called Weave, the Social Fabric Initiative. And we travel around the world, and the whole idea is based on this: social fragmentation is our core problem. And we travel around the world under the belief that the answer to that problem is already out there. The answer to that problem is found in community organizations around the country. I'm involved in one in DC called AOK. It started with this couple, Kathy and David, who had a kid in the DC public schools, and that kid had a friend who had no place to eat because his mom had some drug and health issues. So they said, well, James can come over and be with us. And then James had a friend, and then had a friend. And when I started going to their home about 4 or 5 years ago, they had like 15 mattresses on the floor. And now they have a community of 45 young people, all who descend on their house at different times of the week. And it's just a big extended family. I walk in there the first time, I reach out to shake my hand, the hand of one of the kids, and he says, we don't shake hands here, we just hug here. I'm not a big hugger myself, but I have become one. And that's just building connection where there was none. I was with an organization called Thread in Baltimore. They take Baltimore kids, each kid gets 4 mentors, and then above that there's 4 more who are called the grandparents. Then around that there are all the other helpers. They just basically build a fabric of relationship around each kid. And because they all have phones, when one mentor or volunteer meets the kid, they can tell on their app when there's been a contact. And they call it the Fitbit of social relationships. They can measure when there's a contact, what kid has not been contacted, who's gone 2 hours without a contact. And so what we find around the country are people like this everywhere. I just had a meeting today with about 6 or 8 people from Missoula, somebody from United Way, somebody doing refugee work, somebody doing artistic work, Indian work, all of whom knew each other well, all of whom are weavers in this community. And that's what's going to turn the country around. And what I notice about these people, A, they have moral motivation. We think people are selfish and that altruism is just off on the side of society. But what I see, it's at the center of society. It's what drives us, that yearning for purpose. They really believe in relationships and in vulnerability, that relationship is the agent of change. A friend of mine named Bill Milliken has been doing youth work for 50 years. He says, in all that time, I've never seen a program turn around a life. The only thing that turns around a life is relationship. Some of these people have what I think of as a hole in their soul. They had some wrong that they suffered, and now they're trying to fix society where their wrong happened. I know a guy in DC named Darius. When he was 9, his dad was killed. His dad had an affair with a stripper who arranged his murder. And so now Darius makes sure that young fatherless men have older men in their lives. They have walkout experiences. They leave the organization they would be part of, and they committed to one place. They're totally in love with their town. The woman who created Thread in Baltimore wears the map of Baltimore on a necklace around herself. The people here I met in Missoula are committed to their town. There was a young woman who said, I wanted to build here what people were leaving to get elsewhere. And so there's a ferocious attachment to place. There's radical mutuality. They have a sense that there's no such thing as haves and have-nots. We're all broken, and we're all working on this together. There's a philosophy of personalism that you got to deal with the whole person, that when a kid comes to school, they don't leave their nutrition issues, their safety issues, their other issues behind. You have to deal with the whole human being. And so what I see in these people, most of all, is what I come to think of as vocational certitude. Every single one of them knows why they were put on earth for. They all love what they're doing. It can be completely exhausting and at their end of their rope, but they have their why solved. And it's inspiring to be around people who really have given their lives over to service. And when you're around those people, what you see is people who have a serenity that comes from knowing what you're doing, what you should be doing, and a serenity and really a joy that comes from serving others. And when they talk about what propels them in this unrewarding work, it's always that joy. And so I'll end where I began, with the idea of the heart and soul. The idea that we all yearn for a fusion with another, and we yearn for some righteous cause. And when those things come together, it produces joy. I had a professor I was mentioning today who was in World War II, and when he marched with his men, he said, I lost sense of my own self. I felt a swelling out. I was part of the collective, and that was the most joyous feeling I ever had. Sometimes joy can be when we fuse with those we love. Dorothy Day, one of my heroes, she was about to give birth, and she realized she'd read a lot of accounts of childbirth, but they were all written by men. So she thought she would write one. And she said, if I had painted the greatest painting, sculpted the greatest sculpture, or written the greatest symphony, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. With such a vast flood of love and joy came a need to worship and to adore. And that was just the fusion with their new daughter. Parents, we've all had it. I remember once I was driving home from the NewsHour, and I pulled into my driveway, and I could see in the backyard, and my kids, who were then 12, 9, and 4, were out in the backyard playing with a little plastic ball, kicking it up in the air, and they were just laughing and giggling and tumbling all over each other, chasing the ball and creating a little pile. And I just am confronted unexpectedly by this tableau of perfect family happiness. And I just stood there looking at it through the windshield, and it was one of those moments when life and time seem to spill over their boundaries, and you become aware of a joy you couldn't have earned. It's better than anything you ever get at work, and you sort of swell up and you just want to try to be worthy of that joy out of a deep connection. But I think the higher part of joy comes when people are in unison serving some ideal, some common love. Rabbi Wolf Kellman described what it felt to march to Selma with Martin Luther King. He said, we felt connected in song to the transcendental, to the ineffable. We felt triumph and celebration. We felt that things change for the good and nothing is congealed forever. That was the warmest transcendental spiritual experience. Meaning and purpose and mission were beyond words. Meaning was the feeling, the song, the moment of overwhelming spiritual fulfillment. And that's what people get when they're really in deep relational community. They get that joy. David White, the poet, said, joy is a meeting place of deep intentionality and of self-forgetting. The bodily alchemy of what lies inside of us in communion with what formerly seemed outside but now is neither. Dance, laughter, affection, skin touching skin, singing in the car, music in the kitchen, the quiet, irreplaceable, and companionable presence of a daughter, the sheer intoxicating beauty of the world inhabiting at the edge of what we thought was us and was now is outside of us. That yearning for connection is what you see on the local level everywhere you go in this country. And somehow there's a phrase in the book of Job, and the sparks fly upward. Somehow those local sparks are going to fly upward. Somehow we're going to find a way to weave these local communities and these local deep relationships and have a new paradigm, a new attitude, which will be based on this idea of the whole person, based on the idea of putting relationship at the center, and it will eventually, I think, rebuild social trust and repair the country. Thank you. So I left time for questions, and I think Heidi was gonna ask questions. All I ask if you do ask questions is make them long, rambling, with no question at the end. Hi.
Can you do the card or read the question?
I'll read it out, I guess. Okay. Is opposition to immigration and refugees a natural consequence of tribalism, or are there other major factors that are responsible for turning toward nativism? So I would say it's a direct response. There are two mentalities you can have. One is a scarcity mentality, which is the idea that there's not much in the world and we're just a bunch of groups scrambling for the spoils. And the other is an abundance mentality, that we are ultimately descended from the Garden of Eden, and there's plenty for all. And so the reason, once you get the scarcity mentality based on people whipping up fear, then you get opposition to immigration and refugees. I sometimes want to write a column where I say, I understand why people are opposed to immigration in this country. Going from embracing all this diversity, becoming a universal nation, doing basically what no other country has ever done, that's risky. And yet when you look at the evidence for economically, immigrants fuel our economy. You look at work ethic, you look at faith, you look at criminality. Immigrants are less criminal inclined than anything. Seems to me the evidence for maintaining our status as an immigrant-friendly nation are just overwhelming. And we will just have to find a way to figure out how to live together across diversity. When I go around the country for Weave, I have this interesting phenomenon which I really don't know what to make sense of. I meet in the daytime with community builders, and they are buoyant. And then at night, I get together with citizens of the towns, usually at about 25 at a time. And then they start talking about the system as a whole. And there's anger, fury, alienation, and the mood gets really dark. And both these realities are existing in America today. The hopeful building, communities are built by two things. They're built by a common story, and two, by a project they do together. And these people have a common story for their towns, who we are, and then they're building projects together, whether it's to do the arts, as here, settle refugees, to help kids graduate. But then the anger and the desire for systemic change is massive. And so the trick is to take the core of what we know does change people, which is social relationship, and do it on a larger scale. And finding a way to do that, I think it was best exemplified by what I saw here today, which they call collective impact strategies, where I went into the office across the street at the bar, up in the green room up there, and I met with a business person, with a United Way person, with political people. If you get all the people creating a system of relationship that can focus on social problems, then you've created something systemic and also something relational.
Can you comment on the abandonment of conservative principles by the conservative movement over the past 50 years?
Yeah. So I mentioned I went to the University of Chicago, and I was then a socialist. If you go online, my first TV appearance, I was a socialist, and I was hired by PBS to debate Milton Friedman. And you can see it. I've got a lot of hair and very big glasses. And basically, it's me summarizing some socialistic argument and him destroying it in 6 words. And then the camera lingering on my face for 19 or 20 seconds while I try to think of something to say. But I did read a book in college called The Reflections on the Revolution of France by Edmund Burke. And I hated that book. I wrote a bunch of papers on what an evil guy this was. Because I wanted revolution, I wanted to think for myself, and he said, be careful on what you think you know. The world is complicated. Everything should be incremental. You should show respect for existing institutions. And I hated that. And then I went to become a police reporter, and I covered a place called Cabrini Green, public housing projects in Chicago. And these were housing projects designed by sociologists and others with the best of intentions to tear down old neighborhoods and put up these nice big brick buildings. But when they tore down the old neighborhoods, they tore out the communities, and the brick buildings became horrible. Physically better, but socially much worse. It was an evil effect of good intentions. And I said, well, maybe that guy, Edmund Burke, was right, that doing social change is super hard and complicated, and we should proceed incrementally. And while I was at college, I wrote I was a humor columnist at school paper, and a guy named William F. Buckley came to campus. And I wrote a parody of him for being a name-dropping blowhard. And I said, he comes into rooms and makes everybody else feel inferior. His party trick is to turn water into wine. He started 2 magazines at Yale, one called the National Buckley, one called the Buckley Review, which he merged to form the Buckley. And it was kind of mean. But he came to, at the end of his speech, he said, David Brooks, if you're in the audience, I want to give you a job. And I wasn't in the audience, but 3 years later, I called him. And he became my mentor for 18 months. And I entered the conservative movement. And it was based on Burkean conservatism, respect for the past, respect for community, a belief that politics is a limited activity, that the most important things in our lives are not politics, it's our character, it's our relationships, it's the people we love. And it was a really cohesive community when I entered it in the 80s. And I think it did a lot of good things. I think it helped to hasten the end of the Cold War. I think it re-energized this country. And since 1995, I've seen it slide gradually away from anything I recognize. And now it's the opposite. I mean, when you have the Gingrich Revolution, how could you have a conservative revolution? Conservatives are not revolutionaries. It fell in love with the market. It fell in love with individualism. And it just walked away. And then, in the last 2 years, a guy who is, the other thing conservatives are supposed to believe is that mores are more important than laws, that character is more important than politics. And you've watched a group of people flip those beliefs completely. And it's been a stunning thing for me. I have a friend who served in 3 Republican administrations, and he said, I used to have 2 identity markers. I'm an evangelical Christian, and I'm a Republican. Now I'm not sure I can say that either of those things. So it has been a shocking period, made only more shocking by the fact that so many of my friends are not shocked. And I'm being honest and riffing here, but it's been an amazing period in American history and American life. And I think the only thing we can say is that one thing Trump understood is that we were not having the liberal conservative argument anymore. That was over the size of the state, socialism versus capitalism. That was the market versus the state. But he understood that the argument has changed. It's not that, it's just open, closed. If you have the tailwinds of globalization and the meritocracy pushing behind you, you're for open borders, open trade, open social mores. If you're getting blasted in the face by those things, you want to close borders, close social mores, build walls. And he spoke to that. And so the credit that he deserves credit for is understanding what debate we have. And a lot of us didn't see that coming. The second thing is that there are certain people who are not good at builders, but they're good at destroying corrupt old systems. In the 1960s, there was a guy named Abbie Hoffman. Some of you may remember. He was not a great strategist, but he was good at theater. And he would put on these spectacles that poked holes in the old system. At one level, he's more than this, but Donald Trump is our Abbie Hoffman. He's theatrical, and he pokes holes in things. Along the way, he divides. Every sore spot in our country he divides. But I guess the final thing to say is, one of the revelations for me is loyalty to team trumps loyalty to ideas. And I think that's what we're seeing. And a lot of my friends and I were sort of conservative never Trumpers. we don't know where we'll go. It's a very mystifying period. We spent a lot of time talking about this, about what will happen. I'm not for Elizabeth Warren. I don't agree with her. But so where's the home? And so homeless.
In this chaotic time, how do we as individuals reach across the aisle when there's such a divide?
So I was at a Nationals game, the Washington Nationals baseball, and then in the top of the ninth inning, a guy turned to me and said, "Are you David Brooks?" And I said, "Yeah." And I was hoping for some nice words of compliments. And I won't say the exact words he said, but it was like, "You're an effing a-hole." And I was, it happens from time to time. And then my son, who was with me, leapt in. He attacked him. "You should be ashamed of that man, it's your father." And then my wife leapt in and he attacked her. He just was screaming at me. And I thought a lot, like in retrospect, you think, well, how do you handle that situation? And I think the only wise answer is love your enemy. That the reason people are like that is A, they don't think you're a human being, B, they feel disrespected. And it's the right answer in those situations is to say, okay, let me get you a beer and I'll hear you out. And I've found when somebody sends me super nasty email, if I wrote them back and saying, well, thanks for writing, and they realize there's another human being, they're having a communicative exchange, then they turn nice right away. And so some people are truly evil and they won't, but I've come to the conclusion you just have to love them back. And Martin Luther King was a genius at this. He wrote about this all the time. If you try to build a wall of hate against me, I'll widen my circle to embrace you. And that is, I think that's the only right answer. Having said that, when he's shouting at me in front of my wife and kid, I did not take that strategy. But I regret it.
Your message is well received in Missoula. What reaction does your message receive in conservative audiences? And is your message destined to be branded as a liberal message?
Yeah, I would say it's, I speak in a lot of conservative places, obviously, and I would say it's received well everywhere. I mean, I don't care what party you're in, the sense of national division is just this haunting wound that helps everybody, or hurts everybody, and that everybody feels. There's an organization called Better Angels, one of the great community organizations in this country. And Better Angels takes people, they go to a town, and they look at the social media, they look at the letters to the editor, and they pick the most extreme people on left and right. And they bring them together in a room. And Better Angels is run by a marriage counselor, so they know what they're doing. And one of the things they do is they have each group list the stereotypes that the other throws at them, so they get it on the table. But it's not in an accusatory manner. And halfway through every conversation, there's a moment where somebody says, well, of course, the people like us in this room are going to get along. You should see the real crazies. And the Better Angels people all smile at each other. They don't say it, but then, you guys are the crazies. And I have found this time and again, that the hunger for some sort of communication, some sort of relationship is as strong on one and the other. That doesn't mean there's not real anger and there's not real disagreement, but the number of people who are truly hate-filled, I think, is a relatively small number. And the number of people who commonly love their country is a great number. I used to think, I was in New York down in the World Trade Center, and I remember that 9/11 moment. It happened all at once. And I think that would happen again. I still think that. I used to joke that if we got invaded by Canada, we'd all come together. But now we might actually get invaded by Canada, so I don't say that anymore. But, I spent a lot of time thinking about how do countries turn around in times like this. And the best example is the 1890s to 1910. There was a period of economic transition, massive wave of immigration, political corruption. So 3 things happened. First is a religious revival. The social gospel movement replaced the social Darwinism, which justified selfishness. Second, the civic revival. You had the creation of the Boys and Girls Clubs, the Settlement House, the environmental movement, the temperance movement, the NAACP, the unions, they all came into being. And then a political revival, the progressive movement. So it went religious, civic, political. Today, I'm not sure there's a religious revival, but the ethos these community builders have based on personalism and deep relationality, there's a philosophy in there. The civic revival is happening all around us. So these things will I think, bind us back together. The political revival, good luck with that. But the answer to that is localism. It's devolving power out of Washington and back to the cities. I always ask people, what identity do you care most about? Your town, your state, your nation, or the world? And for me, frankly, it's nation. I care more about nation. For John McCain, it was nation. He cared more about nation than he did about Arizona. For most people I meet, it's town. They love Houston, they love Missoula, they love Baltimore, and you are only going to really throw yourself into a community that you absolutely love. And so to me, the way to get out of the political morass is to just get under it to the local level.
Who do you think wrote the New York Times op-ed last week's Anonymous?
Okay, it was me. Now, my first thought when there was all this speculation is like, if I could go back and make some of my own columns anonymous, that would be great. 'Cause they're not like the best all the time. So the short answer is these things are not shared with me. I have a guess. People are guessing because the column uses a weird word called lodestar. And I think it was Wilbur Ross who used that word in another context. So, but I really do not know.
I'm 17 years old and come from the most loving family I can imagine. I have moments of triumph and moments of hopelessness. How do we young people develop our quest for purpose?
Very good question. The first thing to be said is those moments of hopelessness are moments that everybody has. I teach at Yale, and my students, they'll come to me privately and say, I'm the only person at Yale who doesn't think I belong here. But all of my students believe that. And then there are other moments where the same student will say, I'm killing this place, I'm awesome. And so you get these ups and downs. I would say the most important thing is to reject the idea that the right question, well, there are a couple things come to mind. First, reject the idea that the right question in his life is what can I do to make myself happy? It really is better to commit to others. And most of us in our lives make 4 big commitments. We make a commitment to a spouse and a family, to a vocation, to a philosophy or faith, and to a community. And the fulfillment of our lives is determined by how well we make those commitments and then fulfill them. And a commitment is making a promise to something you love. My favorite definition of commitment is falling in love with something and then building a structure of behavior around it for those moments when love falters. So Jews keep kosher, or Jews love their God, but they keep kosher just in case. And so even at 17, you're years away from making these big commitments, but finding the things you really pour love into, the things that really arouse that kind of love that you want to make a promise to. When you fall in love with something, like whether it's painting, you make a promise to that thing. And sometimes the thing that starts the love can be small. I read a novel by Annie Dillard, and she described a painter, and they said, why did you become a painter? And the painter said, because I love the smell of paint. And it's just that we feel at home with something. We feel at home behind a bar. My daughter feels at home in a hockey rink, so she teaches hockey. And so then you begin thinking about those things. The thing that may seem odd to a 17-year-old, and I can tell you it seems odd to the 21-year-olds, is to start thinking about marriage. The most important decision you're ever going to make is who you marry. If you have a crappy marriage and a great career, you'll be unhappy. If you have a great marriage and a crappy career, you'll be happy. And so I tell college presidents, I'll say it again here, that's the most important decision your students are ever going to make. So every class at college should be about the marriage decision. The sociology of marriage, the neuroscience of marriage, the psychology of marriage. The answer on the psychology is very clear, by the way. Marry agreeableness, avoid neuroticism. And so I would begin thinking about that, like read Jane Austen, read George Eliot, learn from the masters. And then the final thing I'll say is we give students a lot of garbage advice at commencements. But the worst is like, well, the central theme is you'll get these commencements from Steve Jobs and J.K. Rowling about how great failure is. And from this you learn failure seems really great if you're J.K. Rowling. My advice is don't fail, don't fail. But the second is you do you. Look inside yourself, find your passion, follow your own North Star. That's the wrong question to ask. There was a guy who I hope a lot of you are familiar with named Viktor Frankl, and he was a psychologist in Austria in the 1930s, and he was put into a concentration camp. And he said, hey, this wasn't the life I chose. This wasn't what I wanted from life. And he said, now I realize what do I want from life is the wrong question. The right question is, what does life ask of me? What are my circumstances asking of me? What problems around me are those that I'm capable of serving? And so he said, well, I'm a psychologist and I'm in a concentration camp. I'll study suffering. And he noticed that in the camp, some people only lived 3 months, but some people lived for years and years. And he wanted to know the difference. And the difference was that the people who lived for years and years had something outside the camp that they communed with and talked to, even if that person might be dead. And so Frankl talked to his wife. Some people had a book they were thinking of. They had some connection to life outside. They had some ultimate commitment to something. And so there was one young woman who was in the hospital dying in the infirmary. And she said, you know, I'm lucky, I'm glad that I was sent here and that I got this blow. Because before I didn't take spiritual accomplishment seriously, and now I realize that spiritual accomplishment is everything. And she said, I'm very lonely up in this bed. I don't have any friends. So I look out the window and I talk to the tree, the chestnut tree. And Frankl asked her, did the tree ever say anything back to you? And she said, yes, the tree says to me, I am life, I'm eternal life. And she sort of had a glow about her of transcendence in that horrible place, dying in that bed. And so she had lifted her sights up to a higher level, and she'd committed herself to something, some religious belief. And so we think of life as a journey, but it's really a series of marriages. You marry a person, you marry a career, you marry a community, and you tie yourself down. We preach freedom to the young. I've lived in freedom. Freedom sucks. Political freedom is okay. Personal freedom is just unmoored. Personal freedom is just closing off no options. Personal freedom is just being unremembered. Tying yourself down to things is really how we become happy. And now we will pass around the collection plate.
What do you make of the current Russia situation?
I covered the fall of the Soviet Union, as I mentioned, and the birth of Russia. I loved it because with the Russians, it's never a political problem, it's never an economic problem, it's always the Russian soul. And so you have to go to somebody's house and interview at 5 p.m., they start serving vodka, the lights go dark, you're sitting in the dark, and they're talking morosely about the Russian soul. And I actually loved that. That was fun. But the thing you would notice when you go into Russian apartments is that the apartments were nice, but you'd step out into the vestibules and they would reek of urine, the lights would be out, they hadn't been cleaned in years. And you would say to the Russians, you know, there are only 4 apartments around this vestibule, why don't you get together and clean it? And they would say, well, so-and-so's a drunk, so-and-so I don't like. But the real reason was, after 70 years of totalitarianism, they didn't know who was KGB, and so there was no social trust. It's the least trusting society I've ever been in. And so what happened when the Soviet Union fell, instead of working together, they basically stole everything. Everything was stolen. And it's a sign of what happens to society when there's a lack of social trust. And we're gradually, not to that extent, but gradually heading in that direction. And when there's no social trust, you do not have the fabric to hold up a democracy. You have to have some basic level of mutuality to have a democracy or to have capitalism. And they didn't have the underworkings. And we've learned the hard way over the last 25 years, you really have to have the nest to have a democracy. And if the nest isn't there, the democracy can't function because it's based on some set of relationships. And so what Vladimir Putin, the arrival of him seems almost like sociologically determined. He happens to be a particularly ruthless dictator. My favorite story about him, do people know the Bob Kraft Super Bowl ring story? I'll tell that I found it indicative. Bob Kraft is the owner of the New England Patriots. And he went to a delegation and visited Putin, and he was wearing his Super Bowl ring, which he got from being owner of this team. And Putin said, oh, I like your ring. Can I see it? So he took it off and gave it to Putin, and Putin was dangling it through the meeting and was wearing it. And then as the meeting progressed, Putin took the ring and put it into his pocket. And Kraft, after the meeting, went to one of the American diplomats, said, hey, listen, I didn't want to make a big display, but can you just go get Putin my ring? That means a lot to me. I'd be happy to make him a replica, another ring. And so they went to the Kremlin, and they said to the Russians, you know, we'd like the ring back, we'll make you a new one. And they came back to Kraft and said, we're going to write up a press release that you've decided to donate that ring to the Russian people because he's not giving it back. And so what you learn from that is the world is run by 4-year-olds. But it's a dog-eat-dog world in some people's mindset. And so I think the breakdown of that society just had such deep social roots. It's got some of the greatest people on earth in Russia and some of the worst. And so it will just be a continuing menace. And the larger lesson for American policy is the same message when you're clearing weeds. You got to keep clearing them. If you don't keep clearing them, they grow back. And America has withdrawn inward, and a lot of the wolves around the world are just emboldened by that, most especially him.
Who will be the Democratic nominee in 2020, and will Trump be the Republican nominee?
So I'm the guy who wrote 16 columns, all with the theme, don't worry, Donald Trump will never get the Republican nomination. So my powers of prediction are not great right now, and I have no faith in them. I personally, I don't know how many Democratic senators there are right now. I think they're all running for president. And in my view, none of them will get it. And that includes Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris and all the others, and Bernie Sanders. And I say that as just a random guess because having served in Washington is just a bad narrative these days. Second, if you've only been a senator, you probably haven't accomplished all that much because the Senate doesn't do anything anymore. And so I always look around to governors and mayors who actually have records of physical accomplishment. Now, it could be the Democratic Party will just go as far left as the Republican Party has gone right, and we'll wind up that way. That's a very plausible trajectory. But the guy I think would be the strongest candidate for the Democrats is Mitch Landrieu, the former mayor of New Orleans. As I understand it, he's making no preparation to run. But I think he would be a strong candidate because he's got a great record of accomplishment. He's got a good old, regular American sort of ethos. He's very eloquent, profound on racial relations and racial justice, and that's central to our life these days. But he doesn't seem to be running. So, my only observation here is that Donald Trump is today at about 38% approval. And presidents with 38% approvals have very low odds of getting reelected. And so the great mystery, well, the great mystery is how the Democrats are going to find a way to screw it up. I don't know how they will. I know they will.
How worried should we be about the future of American democracy?
We should be a little worried. The problems besetting us are, I think some of the problems that worry me most, one, loss of love of country. As I mentioned, was raised by my grandfather, was an immigrant ethos. And coming to America and being in this country was just winning the biggest lottery ticket on earth. And, I'm out here and, we were Jews on the Lower East Side. But one of my uncles was a guy named Irving Browning. And Irving Browning was an actor in the silent movie era, and then he became a director. And he directed Westerns. And so if you went to his apartment in Manhattan, it looked like you were in Montana in 1860. He had powder horns, he had saddles, he had chaps, he had lassos, he had big cowboy hats, he had Custer's rifle or whatever it was. And the odd thing about him, you really felt like you were in Montana. Just pictures everywhere, memorabilia everywhere. Irving Browning never himself went west of the Hudson River in his life. But he had a vision of what America was. And it was an idealized vision of the West. But a lot of immigrants came here, like the song Yankee Doodle Dandy was written by Isaiah Berlin. I'm Irving Berlin, sorry, wrong Berlin. As an imagined of what the West was like, of what America was like. If you go back to the early 17th century or 18th century, and you look at the diaries of the people who were coming out west to settle, they would write the diaries of what it was going to be like in Wyoming and Arizona and Montana. And the diaries, they're imagining New England small towns. They have no idea what they're getting themselves into. And so they're living in the future in this optimistic way. There's a novel set in, I think, South Dakota called The Giants of the Earth. And a farmer is showing a visitor to his farm. And the farmer says, well, there's my barn, these are my outbuildings, here's my fields. And the visitor says, well, I don't really see anything. And the farmer says, well, I haven't built them yet, but they'll be there. And what I'm trying to say is, we have always been this imaginative nation, and always with a future-oriented mentality where the future seems more real than the present. And as a result of this fevered activity, this sense of promised land, we've moved around more, we've started businesses more, we marry and divorce more, we kill each other more. We're just a fevered, dynamic country. And I sometimes, one of my big fears is that we're losing a little of that dynamism. One of the oddities right now is that mobility, moving from place to place, is plummeting. And young people are moving much less. Starting new business rates are plummeting. Somehow that vibrant energy, sometimes I get a sense it's diminished. If we have energy, we can solve anything. But a reduced country, you'd sort of just settle. And I do worry about that a little. The only remedy to say is, if you read Tocqueville came here in the 1830s, and he described a certain sort of American ethos. It's ups and it's downs. And basically the ethos he's described is still America. That we just have this advantage of having a certain unique culture that makes us sometimes shallow, sometimes dangerous, but always super hopeful. And I have to feel that cultural continuity, the presence of the past, is going to drive us hopefully into the future. But no other country quite has the sense of the American dream, the American story, the American narrative, the American hopefulness that our future is really out there waiting to be seized. Somehow I think it'll just take a leader, and it'll take the grassroots.
How do we address global questions where there's denial of basic scientific underpinnings, such as climate change?
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the hardest things at the current moment. I was with a bunch of economists recently, and they had served in previous administrations, Republican and Democratic administrations, and the hardest thing they're economists, so they believe in facts, they believe in data, they believe in truth-seeking. And they said, does any of that matter anymore? And it doesn't seem to. The one thing I will say is, one of the questions, the debates I have with my friends is Donald Trump just mostly a Twitter feed, or is he actually running the government? And I think the answer is that he's mostly a Twitter feed. Now, with that Twitter feed, he can do enormous damage, in my view, to our cultural norms, to our moral norms, our political norms. But there's no hint of a legislative agenda in the White House. There's no hint of actually doing stuff. Now, that's bad enough. But it's not like, frankly, it's not like Putin, who's super effective. And so that part of this moment, I think, will pass. And hopefully when the change comes, if he does lose the election, it'll be fascinating to see how the Trump supporters react, with anger or with dismissal. And you have to think the odds are on dismissal. One of the things you notice about people in the Trump White House is how quick they are to turn on the president. There's no sense of loyalty, no sense of affection. Usually when you go to a White House, I've covered presidents since Reagan, everybody has the super biggest crush on the president. I once interviewed a guy who it was during the Obama administration, and he had an office that looked over the south lawn of the White House, and Obama was leaving the White House to get on a helicopter to go somewhere. And the guy interrupted the interview and just stood by the window and watched the president's back walk away. And it was like a look of glowing love came over him. It's like the biggest crush ever. And then he sat down with me again, and we conducted the interview. But there's none of that in this White House. There's one of the White House staffers in this White House said to me, did other administrations have a sense of camaraderie? Because we have none of that. And that's the basic truth. And so I don't think there's going to be much shared affection when he's no longer the figurehead or useful in some psychic way.
Well, we wish we could keep asking you questions all night, but this will be the final one. Can the American two-party system survive as currently constituted? For all my life, I've been a person who didn't believe in third parties, just because it's super hard to do. But I will say one thing that I hope is true, that there are two parties, but there are three political traditions in American history. There's a conservative tradition that believes in reducing government to enhance freedom and liberty. There's a liberal tradition that believes in using government to enhance equality and social justice. But there's a third tradition that started out with my hero, Alexander Hamilton, who, as I mentioned earlier, is a Puerto Rican hip-hop star from New York. And his tradition is limited but energetic government to enhance social mobility. He created a system of government, using government in limited ways to give poor boys and girls like him a chance to succeed. And that tradition, after Hamilton died, was picked up by the Whig Party. And the Whigs were always building railroads and canals, and they had banks to invest. It was picked up by Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln actually gave more speeches about banking than he did about slavery over the course of his career. And it was picked up by the Republican Party in the Civil War era. And they did the Land Grant College Act, the Homestead Act, the railroad legislation, all to give opportunity to poor boys and girls. Then it was picked up by Teddy Roosevelt. And then it died.
And yet that tradition, I think, is still out there in the country. And all it lacks is a political institution to carry it forward. I happen to be in that tradition. I'm a Whig. I'm living in the 1850s. But I think it is an answer to a lot of the problems of our day, that we do need some third party. The only problem is there's an ethos of radicalism in the country today, and a third party has to be the most radical party out there, not radical left, not radical right, but radical down. Down into relationship, down into local community, down into this municipal government, and say we are in the middle of a big power renegotiation in this society, and that we have to radically think the ways we build civic architecture. And we have to discover, I'll come back to where I started, this idea that we're all whole people who long for relationship, who long for righteousness, and we have to harness that activity. One of the worst things that's happened is the way we think about politics, that it's a competition between self-interest, that whether it's the Constitution or capitalism, society does not require good people, that you can harness selfishness for good ends. That seems to me fundamentally wrong, a fundamental misjudgment. And so society does require good people who are trusting of each other, who are honest with each other, who respect facts, and we're learning that lesson. And my hope is we will learn that lesson, and we'll focus much more on the formation of our citizens and the formation of our souls than just on the manipulation of our interests. We live in a society that is over-politicized and under-moralized. We talk on TV about every little poll, every little political scandal, but we barely talk about how relationships are formed, how forgiveness works, how to turn moments of suffering into moments of learning. These are actually the big questions of life. And I've made it my vocation in the last, 50 or 60 more years I have, to try to shift the debate a little away from politics toward these other issues, these deeper issues of relationship and moral formation. And I've tried to bring that tonight here, and thank you so much for listening.
I don't know if this one works, but I want to thank everyone again for coming tonight. You know, David, your words were enriching, inspiring, empowering for all of us. You know, we talk a lot in the world of education of creating sparks. And your reference of Job's description of sparks floating upward. You know, we talk at the university about our priorities and placing student success at the center of everything we do. But one of those priorities is also partner with place. And your talk tonight illustrates exactly how we together as partners generate those sparks that can transform and enrich our community. So I want to thank Nick Chakota and Logjam Presents, and I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. And David, thank you again for a wonderful lecture.